Welcome back to another episode of PoliTalks Environment, and today we will be discussing a very specific aspect of the 2024 elections, and this will be related to the Senate, and even more specifically, the Senate election in Arizona in 2024. Now, you may be asking why I chose to single this race out as opposed to many of the other competitive and interesting races in 2024. However, this is an especially fascinating race because we could have potentially a three-person race, three-way race between an independent, a Republican, and a Democrat, which could make this race one of the most anticipated and closely watched elections of 2024. So let's just dive right on into why this race is interesting. And simply that boils down to Kirsten Sinema. Now, if you do not know, I made a video on it a while back. Kirsten Sinema decided she would switch to an independent for her Senate career, and she will be an independent if she decides to run in this race as well. This is a permanent party switch. She is caucusing with Democrats within the Senate, so effectively not much has changed within the Senate. But what has changed is it means that she will not be subject to the normal primary process for Democrats because she will run in this race no matter what. She can actually not be primaried. She cannot be defeated in a primary because she's no longer a Democrat, which means that this is a politically advantageous move for her and her alone because she can run in this race without having to win a primary. And not only that, Democrats may feel pressured not to run in this race because they could end up splitting the votes and giving the win in this race to a Republican, even one such as Carrie Lake or Blake Masters, who would never normally win an Arizona Senate election in a year like 2024, in which the presidential candidates are on the ballot. So that is making this race especially fascinating. However, Ruben Gallego, a United States representative who is on the more progressive side, has announced their candidacy in this race, which means that now the pressure is on Sinema to step out of this race, or she will be the one blamed not only for switching parties and the loyalties, but also for potentially handing this race to Republicans. So this is really simply a fascinating race. Kirsten Sinema has already filed paperwork, but we have to understand, even if she does not run for re-election, how much of a politically advantageous move this is for her. Because if she does decide to run, she doesn't have to run in the primary, and the Democrat may feel pressured to drop out. And it's not only that, it's a relatively unimpactful for her recent Senate life, for the recent tenure in the Senate, but it is a strong statement on her part that she does not align with the modern Democratic Party or the modern Republican Party for that matter, and she is truly an independent. So, of course, I explained that in my video when she did in fact switch parties, her rationale, and the advantages it brought her, but that has already happened. So now I wish to look at the various scenarios we could see in this race, and it's clear just by reading the news that this is a massive curveball. People were not expecting this, and this completely throws the race out of proportions because Sinema was originally expected to run as a Democrat, and while there was talk of a primary against her, she, in all likelihood, would end up winning the primary, and Democrats would have no choice but to back her for Senate to prevent an even worse, in their view, even more conservative senator from being elected. Now, this is clearly a massive decision, and it is a curveball, as this article mentions, leading up to this race. But now we'll be discussing the several scenarios this race could take, and we will be discussing each one and their likelihood. So, option one is that Kirsten Sinema does end up running, and she and the Democratic challenger, Ruben Gallego, engage in an arms race of sorts and try and play chicken to see who will drop out first, but neither ends up dropping out. So what that means is that both of them will be running against a single Republican who will, of course, unite the Republican vote. There was talk of potentially Sinema attracting some like independent or moderate Republican votes, but just purely on the fact she used to have a D next to her name, I do not think that is the reality. So what that means is in this scenario, even if the Republican candidate is someone like Carrie Lake or Blake Masters, both of whom lost in the 2022 elections and have shown that they are not the most electable candidates within the state of Arizona, even if they run, they would more than likely win in this first scenario because simply there's too much liberal vote being split. Even if around 5 to 10% of Democratic voters go to Sinema instead of Gallego, that would more than likely hand the race to Republicans on account of Arizona being a competitive state. But both candidates know that, and both candidates know that this is probably one of the worst years that they could be doing this because this is 2024 when Democrats already have so many other states at risk and their Senate majority is extremely fragile. They cannot really win the Senate without winning this race. And they really need to make this race nigh safe, nigh locked up by election day. And then they can focus on states such as Montana, West Virginia, and Ohio, the three which they certainly need to win 2 of, and then they need to win all other states. So they really need to make a very large slate of states safe by this election. That includes, of course, the Rust Belt states. All of those need to be absolutely certain by election day. Democrats can't even worry about those. They need to spend minimal fundraising. Nevada needs to be at least in a good point for Democrats. And Arizona, too, needs to be at least a lean for Democrats. That way, they can focus on the 3 Republican-leaning states, and they can put all their effort into winning 2 out of the 3, because they need 2 out of the 3, and that's assuming that the Democratic Party wins the presidency, or should I say the vice presidency, because if Ron DeSantis wins the 2024 election, then they need to win all of their current states, which is almost certain not to happen. So this is simply an illustration of the predicament Democrats have found themselves within, and it is a very tight predicament. And if Democrats are splitting the vote in the state, which needs to be locked up by election day, then that is not acceptable. So I do not think this first scenario is all that likely, because I think in the end one of the candidates will end up seeing the greater picture and knowing that they really need to prioritize Democrats winning at all costs, even if it means their own withdrawal from the race. So, what that means is I think one of the candidates will end up dropping out from this race and allowing the other to win. But the question is, which candidate does that? And the question we have to ask before that is, will Sinema even run? Because that is under the assumption Sinema runs. She has filed paperwork, but she's not yet made a formal announcement. And I do think that Sinema will end up running, if only a statement. But I think that Sinema eventually will be the one who will end up dropping out of the race for several reasons. First of all, her Senate tenure for the future is really being called into question as both parties, she has found herself the enemy of both parties. Same situation as Joe Manchin. And this may result in Democrats being far less favorable to her, giving her inferior committee assignments, generally poor treatment, which could mean that she does not feel incentivized to have another term in the Senate. But although she is certainly not a quitter, so I do expect she will run in this race even just to prove the point and make Democrats worry and spend money and focus on this race, even if it's just a statement. So, I do expect Sinema, though, will ultimately end up being the one to drop out of this race. It could be even perhaps weeks or even days before the election, but I do think she'll eventually come to realize that she is the enemy of many people in her state, and I think she'll realize that she needs to drop out, or else she will be forever at the blame of Democrats, and her political future will essentially be capitulated at that point because she will be so unpopular nationally and frankly within her state, assuming that she does deny Democrats the victory. So, I do expect that will happen. But those are only several of the scenarios that could potentially occur. Another one is that Ruben Gallego drops out of the race first. And in this scenario, I do expect Kirsten Sinema would end up winning because Democrats certainly wouldn't support the Republican. Perhaps some of them would boycott the race, but they would also probably have the same realization as Sinema that they really need to win this race. And in order to do that, they need to vote for someone, even if they believe they are not a true Democrat by nature. But I do think Sinema would have a lesser chance of winning than Gallego in this situation, just purely because she cannot really unite the entire Arizona Democratic base, and some Democrats may choose to throw protest votes or simply not vote at all because of how unpopular she is. So that is just an illustration of the curveball that Kirsten Sinema has thrown Arizona Democrats, and we will be watching in the coming months. I cannot emphasize that there is time aplenty between now and the 2024 elections for Kirsten Sinema to announce her candidacy or announce her withdrawal from this race. But whatever ends up happening, I can tell you that I do believe that someone will eventually drop out in this race, but it could potentially end up dragging on and being very costly to Democrats as they end up attempting to secure a 2024 Senate majority. And I will end this video on this note by saying that Arizona has been trending more purple in the coming election cycles. We saw a 2.4% margin this last election and a slightly larger margin this election, and most recently in 2022, the largest margin yet for a Senate candidate. And ultimately, what I think this ends up meaning is that Arizona is trending purple, and I think the only way I could foresee Republicans winning this race, assuming if DeSantis is the Republican nominee, that is an entirely different ballgame because he could potentially rally voters in this state and have a coattail effect, but that's for another time. He hasn't even announced his candidacy, let alone become the nominee for the Republicans. But I do believe that this state will go to a Democrat unless my first scenario I discussed occurs and Sinema and Gallego, neither of them drop out, which would, I believe, in that scenario, give Republicans, I think, a lean margin in the state or perhaps a tilt. But in all other scenarios, I see either Sinema or Gallego winning by a lean margin, assuming they are the only left-leaning candidate in this race. So, thank you for tuning in to another episode of PoliTalks, where I discuss the 2024 Senate election in Arizona. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope that you found this informative, and we can look back on it in 2024 and see which of the scenarios ended up occurring and whether my predictions were correct. Thank you very much. See you later.